mind out of the body. Now, I know there's a lot of breaths out there and there's a lot of ways to move energy, but I want to give you a little bit of the science and a little bit of the body physiology to understand why we're doing this breath. So, most people think that there's a mind and that there's a body, and that the two are very separate entities. That in the 1700s, when Descartes was interested in doing his scientific experiments on the body, he viewed the body as something as very objective, and he saw the mind as very convoluted and very subjective. And he said, okay, well look, the mind is a little bit too unpredictable. I'm going to leave that to the church, and we'll call that the sphere of religion. And the body tends to be more objective and more studyable, so we'll call that the sphere of science. But I want you to know that there's never a time where your mind isn't influencing your body, and there's never a time where your body isn't influencing your mind. Every time you have a thought, there's a biochemical reaction in your brain. When you begin to think about something, you turn on different circuits in your brain. All of a sudden, another part of the brain begins to release a chemical, and that chemical causes you to begin to feel exactly the way you were just thinking. So if you have an insecure thought, in a matter of seconds, you begin to feel insecure. Now, the moment you start feeling that feeling, those emotions, the brain is constantly monitoring how your body's feeling, and all of a sudden, the moment the brain notices that you're feeling insecure, you're going to begin to generate more corresponding thoughts equal to the way you were just feeling. So you'll think more insecure thoughts, which will produce more chemicals for you to begin to feel more insecure, and then the moment you feel more insecure, you're going to begin to think more insecure thoughts, and that loop, that cycle of thinking and feeling is what creates your state of being. So, if you keep thinking thoughts like, my boss is unfair, I hate my job, what an idiot driver, I can't take my life, you keep thinking those thoughts, you keep producing the same chemicals, and you begin to cause different parts of your brain to influence another part of your brain, and that other part of your brain, in the limbic brain, begins to make what's called neuropeptides. Those neuropeptides are chemical messengers that begin to signal different hormonal centers. So if you're thinking frustrating and angry and hateful and judgmental thoughts, you're going to begin to feel that way because the neuropeptides that are made in your limbic brain are going to signal your adrenal glands in your third center and make you feel pretty aroused. The moment you feel that feeling, you're broadcasting energy out of this third center, and when you're feeling those emotions, your brain is monitoring that you're feeling pretty angry and frustrated and judgmental and hateful, and you're going to drive those thoughts even further. So now you're going to fire more thoughts equal to the way you're feeling, hardwiring your brain into a very specific pattern, and continuously produce the same emotions in your body. Over time, the repetition of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking takes all of that thought and stores it as energy emotionally in the third center. And now the body's becoming the mind of anger and frustration and hatred and judgment. Not a lot of people spend a lot of time opening their heart. Not a lot of people spend a lot of time trusting and to be vulnerable, because it would go counter to the conditions in their environment. And if they're living in survival, they're living in stress, and they're getting the rush of adrenaline from the hormones of stress, they become very attached to those emotional states, almost addicted to them in a sense. So then it makes sense that it's not a time to open their heart. It's not a time to be vulnerable. It's not a time to trust. It's a time to run, fight, and hide. So most people then have most of the energy stored in their body in those first three centers, and so there's got to be a way to begin to pull the mind out of the body and to begin to liberate that energy. Now, your body is a magnet, and a magnet has a north pole and a south pole. And the stronger the polarity between the north pole and the south pole, the more the magnet has an invisible electromagnetic field. And Asian cultures have known about the body as a magnet for thousands and thousands of years. And as the current moves from the North Pole to the South Pole, the movement of polarity of the current begins to produce this invisible electromagnetic field. Most people can't see it, but it exists. And if you took a piece of paper and you laid it down and you put metal shavings on top of it, you put a magnet on top of those metal shavings, all of a sudden all those metal shavings would align themselves within the electromagnetic field of the magnet. In other words, energy is influencing matter. So then, if you're drawing from this invisible field of electromagnetic energy that's surrounding your body and living in survival and turning it into chemistry, and you're reducing the electromagnetic field around your body and thinking and feeling in the same cycle, and you're causing all that energy to be stored in the first three centers and it's not moving, then your body becomes like a piece of metal with no electromagnetic field, like a magnet with no charge, just an inert piece of metal. There's no field and there's no charge. So the breath that we do is a way to begin to move energy from those first three centers all the way back up into the brain. And we do it to run a current through the body and to produce an electromagnetic field, just like a magnet. So, how do we do it? So the bone at the base of your spine, called the sacrum, it's an upside down triangle. It has a plateau on the top, and that plateau is a base that the spinal column sits on. Now the spinal column goes from your lower back all the way up, right up into this ivory cavern called your skull. And that closed system of the spinal column, the brain, and the sacrum houses the most delicate system in your body called the central nervous system. Now, your central nervous system controls and coordinates all other systems in your body. You couldn't digest your food, you couldn't blink your eyes, you couldn't void your bladder, you couldn't move, your heart couldn't beat. Nothing would happen without the aid of your nervous system. In fact, your nervous system is like the electrical wires that run the machine. Now, in that closed system, the bony structures that protect the most delicate system, the brain and the spinal cord being an extension of the brain, there's fluid inside that closed system called cerebral spinal fluid. Now, cerebral spinal fluid has some important roles. The first thing is it creates buoyancy for the nervous system to float. It acts as a protective cushion in case there's trauma. The bony edges of certain areas of the skull can move without being traumatized. The cerebrospinal fluid has pathways that transfer chemicals and neurotransmitters to other parts of the nervous system, like rivers. And the act of that cerebrospinal fluid bathing the brain and the spinal cord really facilitates electrical charges in the nervous system, so it amplifies conductivity in the nervous system. So there's little filters in the brain that filter blood and create cerebrospinal fluid. So when that sacrum at the base of your spine works with your skull, every time you inhale, normally take a small breath, your sacrum flexes slightly back, and when you exhale, it flexes slightly forward. At the same time, when you inhale, the sutures of your skull open up, and when you exhale, the sutures close. So imagine then, when you inhale, the sacrum flexes back, the skull bones open up, and that cerebrospinal fluid can drain. When you exhale and the sacrum flexes forward and the sutures close, it propagates a wave and pushes the cerebrospinal fluid forward. So the act of moving that sacrum along with the coordination of the skull propagates a little wave. And as it moves and begins to move that cerebrospinal fluid by inhaling and exhaling, slowly those molecules move all the way up through the spinal cord, all the way up to the brain through 4 different rooms called aqueducts or ventricles, and then it comes all the way down. And if you were to tag one molecule of cerebrospinal fluid, it would take about 12 hours for that whole process to take place. So, what would happen if you were to contract your intrinsic muscles, your perineum, the muscles you use for intercourse and elimination, your lower abdomen and your upper abdomen? As you contract those intrinsic muscles and lock down the muscles associated with these first 3 centers and squeeze, if you were to squeeze these muscles, the act of squeezing these muscles begins to move the cerebrospinal fluid up in this direction. What if you were to take your attention and place it on the top of your head? Where you place your attention is where you place your energy. And I ask you to work your fingernail into the top of your head If I ask you to take your hand down, could you still feel that point? That's your target. And what if you were to couple a breath, one slow, steady breath, with the intention of pulling the mind out of the body? And you were to inhale, and the exact same time that you inhale, contract those intrinsic muscles and follow your breath from your perineum, through your lower abdomen, through your upper abdomen, through your chest, through your throat, through your brain, all the way to the top of your head. And when you got to the top of your head, I asked you to keep those muscles contracted and hold your breath with your attention on the top of your head. As you inhale and you contract those intrinsic muscles, you begin to accelerate that cerebral spinal fluid back towards your brain. Now, cerebral spinal fluid is made of proteins and salts in solution. If you take a protein and a salt and you drop it in solution, they begin to create a charge. So cerebral spinal fluid is made of charged molecules. So when you inhale and you contract those intrinsic muscles and you begin to pull that energy from those lower centers up into your brain, as you accelerate this cerebral spinal fluid, if you take a charged molecule, this is physics now, and you accelerate a charged molecule in one direction, it creates an invisible field in the movement of that charged molecule called an inductance field. If you accelerate several charged molecules, you create a bigger inductance field. So now, you have information that's traveling up and down your spinal cord from your brain to your body and from your body to the brain. You're paying attention to the pain in your back, you're paying attention if you're hungry, you got information coming from your brain instructing your body to do certain things. So this fiber optic cable has got communication going up and down. The moment you contract those intrinsic muscles and you inhale and you start accelerating that cerebral spinal fluid up towards your brain and you create this inductance field, the movement of this inductance field up towards the brain begins to draw energy from the centers, lower centers, in this direction. So all the energy you use for orgasm, all the energy you use to digest a big meal, all the energy you use to run from a predator, instead of it being released out, it's going to be released up. And when this is done properly, with a level of intensity, a level of passion that's greater than any addiction to any emotion, and you use your body as an instrument to ascend your energy, if you do this properly, you are waking up a sleeping dragon. And as that energy begins to come uncorked, as it begins to move up your spine, the moment that energy starts moving up in this direction, the sympathetic nervous system switches on and it merges with the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, your sympathetic nervous system is usually what you use to run from a predator when the body gets aroused. But in this case, the arousal is coming from within. And as you begin to elevate your energy and move this energy, when that energy starts moving in the sympathetic nervous system, literally ejaculates that energy up into your brain, that energy starts moving up your spine, and there's a little gate at your brainstem called the thalamic gate. And that thalamic gate is what edits information going from your brain to your body and from your body to the brain. And there's a cluster of nuclei called the reticular formation. That's a net-like formation, a labyrinth where things have to move. When this energy starts to move and it gets to the brainstem and it's moving and the sympathetic nervous system is switched on, that thalamic gate opens up. And when that thalamic gate opens up and that energy is forced into the brain, once that energy makes it past the thalamic gate, it hits these little junction boxes, the thalamus and the brain, two of them, and it sends information to the higher brain centers. And the moment that happens, the brain goes into gamma brainwave patterns, a very, very superconscious state. We've measured this hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times in our students. Now, gamma is superconsciousness. Gamma is now the same similar frequency as high beta, but in this case, the arousal is not coming from some threat in your outer environment. The arousal is coming from your body, and that energy is moving back into the brain, and the person now, whatever's happening between their ears is absolutely real. So, in gamma, when you're super conscious and you're super aware, the pictures that are going on in your brain become the experience. So, if the emotion is stored in the body, then the body's in the past. the breath then is a way to free yourself from the past. And using the body as an instrument of consciousness to ascend your energy means you can't do it by your body trying to change your body. When you do this breath, you have to become passionate. You have to become more energy than matter. So, let's go over a few things here. It's a lot of information. As you inhale through your nose and you start to inhale and contract those intrinsic muscles, as you begin to pull that energy all the way up and you follow it all the way to the top of your head, you're accelerating that cerebrospinal fluid and you're coaxing that energy to begin to shake loose. And you're going to have to do it over and over again, over and over again. And as you begin to wake this energy up, once it begins to become aroused and the sympathetic nervous system switches on, and that energy from these lower centers begins to move into the brain, there goes all the guilt. There goes all the anger, there goes all the hatred, there goes all the judgment, there goes all the shame. And it's just turning into pure energy. The body's being liberated. Now, remember, a magnet has a charge. And so then as the energy starts to move up your spine, just like a magnet that has a movement of electrical charges, the body becomes like a magnet and it begins to produce a measurable electromagnetic field. Now, the current that's running through the body is beginning to produce the same type of field that a magnet has. So now, the body's liberating energy. That energy makes its way into the brain, and as the energy moves up the spinal column, up the spinal cord, and the thalamic gate opens up and the brain goes into gamma, that energy moves right up into the pineal gland. Pineal gland sitting right at the back of the third ventricle in the brain. And when that energy strikes the pineal gland, that pineal gland sitting right between each one of those individual thalami, those two thalamuses, right in between is the pineal gland. And when that energy strikes the pineal gland, all of a sudden it begins to change the fundamental metabolites of the pineal gland. Now the pineal gland is responsible for making serotonin and melatonin. Serotonin is the daytime neurotransmitter. When you're perceiving light in your environment, the signal is sent to the back of the eye, signals the nucleus in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which then signals the sympathetic nervous system to begin to make serotonin, and you get up and you get going. Your brain waves go into beta and you're conscious of your body in space and time. When there's less light in your outer environment, the inhibition of light all of a sudden sends the same signal to the optic nerve, and the inhibition of light then sends the same pathway, the information to the same pathway, and now the pineal gland gets busy taking serotonin and turning it into melatonin. And melatonin is a nighttime neurotransmitter. It makes us sleepy. It's the dreaming chemical. And the body begins to slow its brain waves down. So serotonin gets us up and going. Melatonin makes us sleepy and drowsy. So when the energy begins to strike the pineal gland, the moment that liberated energy interacts with the pineal gland, it begins to alter the function of melatonin to make some sister molecules that are very, very upgraded versions of melatonin. Now, melatonin is naturally an antioxidant, but when it turns into one of these two chemicals, it's now two of the most powerful antioxidants known to man. Anti-cancer, anti-aging, anti-heart disease, anti-stroke, anti-neurodegenerative, anti-inflammatory, antimicrobial. You take that molecule and you tweak it again, and you have a benzodiazepine, Valium. Now melatonin isn't only just relaxing you, now you're very relaxed. And in the latest research in the amygdala and the release of benzodiazepines, what it does is it shuts off the survival centers in the brain. You can't be angry, you can't be aggressive, you can't be fearful, you can't be anxious, you can't be sad, you can't feel pain. So you chill out, and as the energy strikes the brain, it anesthetizes and sedates the analytical mind and the thinking brain. You take that molecule, you tweak it again, you have the same chemical found in hibernating animals. And what's the importance of that? Well, hibernation, no appetite, no sex drive, no preoccupation with your outer environment. It's time to go within. The body goes into stasis. So now your body is no longer bothering you, no longer running the show. In that state where you have the same chemicals found in hibernating animals, you're more likely to stay present with your inner vision. You take that molecule, you tweak it again, you have the same chemical found in electric eels, a biophospholuminescent chemical. Now, when electric eels produce energy in their nervous system, they're amplifying energy in their nervous system. They're producing higher amplitudes of energy. And in our brain research, when a person has a mystical experience, many, many times, we see these very high amplitudes of energy in gamma in their brain. And we know that more than likely it's this molecule. You take that molecule, you tweak it again, and you have dimethyltryptamine, the most powerful hallucinogenic known to man. Now the person's inner world is way more real than their outer world. They are having a mystical moment. And as that energy begins to move up into the brain, the release of that energy begins to produce upgraded versions of melatonin and prepares the brain for an interdimensional experience. So, when we do the breath, I ask you to inhale through your nose, and I ask you to draw that energy all the way to the top of your head, and then I ask you to keep those muscles contracted and to hold your breath for a short period of time. Now, I'm not doing that to torture you. I'm doing that because as you move this cerebral spinal fluid up to your brain, it passes through those small aqueducts, those little rooms, those little ventricles. And as it moves from the fourth ventricle up into the third ventricle, and you hold your breath and squeeze. When you squeeze and hold your breath, you're increasing what's called intrathecal pressure. Now, intrathecal pressure is when you lift something up that's heavy and you hold your breath and you push against your insides. That's intrathecal pressure. So when I ask you to inhale and hold your breath and squeeze, you're increasing intrathecal pressure. And you're forcing that cerebral spinal fluid up through those ventricles. Right at the back of the third ventricle is the pineal gland. And as you begin to force that fluid up into those ventricles, you're creating extra pressure and a mechanical stress. Now, inside the pineal gland, that little tiny gland, are tiny little calcite crystals that are shaped in octahedrons and tetrahedrons, and they're stacked on top of each other. Now, when you increase intrathecal pressure, I've done the research on this, they've called the pineal gland a neuroendocrine transducer with piezoelectric properties. Don't panic. But when you force that fluid up into your brain, you're increasing intrathecal pressure. You begin to compress those tiny little crystals. Now, the piezoelectric effect is when you take one form of pressure or energy and convert it into another one. So then now you're increasing mechanical stress up against the crystals of the pineal gland, and it's being translated into an electrical charge. It's producing an electrical field. So now the piezoelectric effect is beginning to cause the pineal gland to become activated electrically. It's the act of it becoming activated electrically that begins to produce a resonant electromagnetic field that it emits. And as the field begins to be emitted and the crystals begin to stretch, the field begins to open up. And then when the crystals can't stretch anymore, they start to compress and the field reverses. And the reversal of that field begins to compress the crystals, which then produces another electromagnetic field. And now you have a tiny little antenna that begins to become signaled. And if you keep doing it over and over again, and you keep compressing it, the signal gets faster and faster and faster. And all of a sudden now, you can tune in to frequencies beyond visible light. And now the pineal gland acts as a transducer. A transducer is just like your television set. It's going to take a frequency and turn it into imagery. And now your brain is going to have a very transcendental experience. You're going to have a full-on sensory experience without your senses. Now think about this. What would happen right now if your senses were amplified by 30%? Everything you were seeing, everything you were hearing, everything you were tasting, smelling, or feeling. If your senses are heightened by 30%, so is your awareness of the environment. And if your awareness of the environment is amplified, you're more conscious in your environment. And you can't have consciousness without energy. And all of a sudden now, your brain is processing a new stream of consciousness that's carrying a very profound level of energy. And whatever is going on between your ears is more real than this world that you're in right now. And that's, of course, the mystical moment. So we do the breath then to pull the mind out of the body and to liberate energy, to run a current up our spine, just like a magnet, to produce an electromagnetic field. And when it's done properly, and this energy begins to move, it's like a moving freight train. It is a lot of energy traveling back to the brain, and sometimes the body does all kinds of things. Don't be afraid of it. When it starts to happen, surrender to it. You're just freeing yourself emotionally from the past. Now, like anything you practice, any skill you learn, it takes repetition. In the beginning, I don't want you working too hard and holding your breath and turning purple. That's not the purpose of this breath. It's a slow, steady breath through the nose, and at the same time lifting the same muscles you use for intercourse and elimination, as well as your lower abdomen and your upper abdomen. As you lock those centers down and milk them, and you inhale through your nose with the intention of pulling that energy back to your brain, as you follow it all the way to the top of your head and you keep your attention on the top of your head, you squeeze those muscles and hold your breath. Where you place your attention is where you place your energy. And as you let it build and surrender, the best way that I could describe this is that you're making love to your brain. You're using the same muscles, but instead of releasing that energy out, you're going to learn how to move it up into your brain. When it begins to move, it's a lot of energy moving back to your brain, and when it reaches your brain, you experience ecstasy, you experience bliss, you have an orgasm in your head. We've measured this thousands of times in our students. As a matter of fact, we can predict when it's going to happen because we can see their brain waves slow down. Then all of a sudden we see them move into high beta, and when they move quickly to high beta like that, we know they're going to move right into gamma. And sometimes the amount of gamma that they're producing in their brain is way, way outside of normal range. I mean, very far outside of normal range. And the whole entire brain is going into that state, and they're connected to that field, because as that energy moves up and produces an electromagnetic field, there's a reverse field that starts to happen in the opposite direction, and now energy begins to come right through their nervous system, through the top of their head. And many students have said, it was like my body was filled with light, like a cone of light or energy was coming right through the top of my head. And of course, when that occurs, every cell in their body is getting a biological upgrade. They are connected to the field, and they always say it's the most familiar, unfamiliar feeling I've ever had. So in some of the meditations we'll be doing in this course, you're going to have to learn how to pull the mind out of the body. And the act of doing that is to move energy. The act of doing that is to free up energy and produce your own field. So you're not just matter trying to change matter. You're energy influencing matter. So be kind to yourself, practice it. Some of the meditations that we start with this breath because it's a good way to produce coherent brainwave patterns. And the research that we've done is not only the brain is super coherent during this process, in other words, the whole brain is working together, but we always see very, very high amounts of energy in the brain, and that's energy that you're going to use to design a new destiny.